Hello, and welcome back to Checkmate, Atun-Shei, this series where I wonder and ponder about the lackluster content of a not-so-tender soul who goes by the name Atun-Shei. In this episode, we'll be looking into the 5th episode of Checkmate Lincolnites. Was Sherman a war criminal? Based on the previous episodes of his series, I wonder how much he'll actually address this rather sensitive topic. Will he focus on the question at hand, or will he deflect like he did in the previous episode? Well, we'll find out shortly. However, before we begin, I wish to address what this video will be like. Unlike the previous few episodes, I won't be including any comedic elements. My reason for why is simple. The subject at hand should be treated with the utmost respect. The question of whether a general was a war criminal, and discussing the acts committed by these men at this time, requires discussing some disturbing accounts. As a result, it would be inappropriate to add any comedic elements in this episode. I do not want to detract from the gravity of the crimes committed, their perpetrators, and the consequences of their crimes. It is a serious topic, therefore, it should be addressed in a straightforward, sincere manner. With this being said, let us begin. The video begins with the same brand of humor that's dominated this entire series. Exceptionally stale, dry humor. Humor so dry that not even the Fremen could find any moisture in it. However, something different happens. Instead of wasting my time with his attempts at humor, he has evolved. He now wastes my time by promoting his merchandise, while also using his brand of dry humor to shill his content. In fact, when I watched this, I thought to myself, why would anyone want to burn $20 or more on an Atun-Shei shirt? Then again, I remember what his fan base is like and realized that they would do this, and then some. After wasting 2 minutes of time on his shilling, we finally get to the main topic of the video, Sherman as a war criminal. Yet, before we can even get into this topic properly, he discusses the topic of Sherman memes, which Atun-Shei plasters a few examples in the video. The issue with most of these memes is the entire issue with Sherman posting in general. It's unoriginal trite. Most of the memes commonly circulated around are near-decade-old memes that Sherman posters repost every single time someone expresses an opinion that does not correlate with their worldview. However, in order to justify these lackluster memes, Atun-Shei offers the following excuses. For their malicious intent, he argues that the memes are clearly tongue-in-cheek. For their idolization of Sherman, he argued, you know how you consider Stonewall Jackson to be the embodiment of big dick energy. It's the same with us and Sherman. There are several flaws with this, which only takes a casual look at Twitter to see the true intention behind these memes. Firstly, these memes are not meant to be tongue-in-cheek. Many of the people who Sherman posts have strongly negative opinions about the South and Southerners, often adding into their Sherman posting mockery of Southerners as inbreds or ignorant. Then, they'll usually add to this the desire to commit violence against the modern Southern population. And all of this because someone simply does not agree with their worldview. These memes are not meant to be taken as tongue-in-cheek, but as an expression of intent. Many Sherman posters openly hate Southerners. They do not hide this. They make their vitriol explicit. Secondly, Atun-Shei makes a false equivalency between the South's veneration of Thomas J. Jackson and those who Sherman posts. The Southerners who idolize Jackson or Lee do so because there are many virtues to embody: their faith, their nobility, their sense of honor, and their sense of dignity. Many of these virtues were openly stated by those who knew these men, including Union generals such as Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman posting, however, does not venerate Sherman's virtues. Sherman posting is centered around the atrocities Sherman committed. They idolize his sins over any virtues he may have held. It is this fundamental failure to understand the difference between why either side idolizes these men that discredits the argument being presented by Atun-Shei. Shortly after these two initial claims, he attempts to justify Sherman posting by saying the following.
It's not so much a celebration of Sherman himself, but more our idea of Sherman, a fiery force of patriotic nature that kicks slave owner ass. And unlike you guys, we understand that distinction. In many ways, Sherman was absolutely awful. We don't have to delude ourselves about him like you do about Jackson and Lee.
This argument misconstrues Jackson and Lee by arguing that what Southerners idolize is somehow a figment of their own imagination rather than the reality of these men. Jackson and Lee were consistently described as virtuous men by those who knew them, including those on the opposing side of the conflict. It isn't some ideal version, but the reality of these men. They were larger than life. In fact, neither side has deluded themselves into believing a narrative. Rather, both sides believe in the figures they do because of their tangible actions. For Southerners, it is Lee and Jackson's tangible faith, honor, and valor as leaders. For Northerners, especially Sherman posters, it's Sherman's unbridled destruction of the South, a projection of their own hatred of Southerners through the avatar that is William Tecumseh Sherman. If anything, the only folks believing in the delusion are the Sherman posters. They see themselves as Sherman marching through the South and crushing everything and anyone they hate. It is their perpetual grudge against the South for not bending to their will that drives their Sherman posting. Shortly after bringing up this point, Johnny Rip brings up the valid point of how, on r/Sherman posting, a subreddit on the website known as Reddit, there is constant bashing of modern conservatives by members of the subreddit. However, Atun-Shei tries to refute this by saying that there's a rule about pointless South bashing. This, of course, is ironic as it implies that the moderators of the subreddit would ever apply the rule at all. In fact, anyone who's been on the internet for more than a year would know that moderators have liberal interpretations of the rules, often allowing for their own biases to dominate their judgment. Even then, this isn't enough to refute the core purpose behind Sherman posting: to demonize, demean, and express hatred towards the Southern population. However, if there is one good thing to come out of this discussion so far, it is that Atun-Shei does not support the irrational hatred of Southerners. At least, that's what he claims. His statement of opposition does not prove convincing enough, at least for me, considering his content has facilitated the very hatred for years against countless people, including those directed at online acquaintances of mine, and, of course, me as well. Though this topic is an interesting topic of discussion, I don't see how this is relevant to Sherman's actions and his crimes during the war. In fact, he doesn't properly discuss Sherman's actions during the war until nearly 9 minutes into the video. Rather, he first discusses the topic of Sherman posting, then he spends time discussing slavery, and then he spends time discussing the industrial capacity of the South and North. Something he probably should have discussed 2 videos earlier, when it was actually relevant. The entire issue with Atun-Shei's videos is they have all of this unnecessary filler, none of which is relevant to the topic at hand. Either discuss the topic or don't include it in the video. Don't waste my time with this nonsense. It's not until 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the video that we finally discuss the main topic at hand, Sherman's march and the war crimes committed during it. In this, he leads the discussion with several claims, namely that there's little evidence corroborating the idea of mass murder and rape occurring during the march to the sea. In this, he brings up how Lincoln initially wanted to treat the Southern population with cordiality and restraint during the early part of the war. In this, there are several issues. First and foremost, there's the issue that crimes, such as murder and rape, were not likely reported as often during the wartime period. In fact, to draw upon a not-so-sympathetic source to the Southern cause, an article by, of all publications, The Atlantic, this very issue of the underreporting of crimes of this nature is discussed concerning the crime of rape. In fact, later on in the video, Atun-Shei would go on to contradict himself by pointing out the same underreporting of rape. Worse still, murders did take place and were perpetrated by both sides during the march to the sea and the subsequent march into South Carolina. This took the form of the execution of at least several prisoners of war by Union troops, something, I might add, that is considered a war crime, in response to attacks against their men by the bitter population, both free and enslaved, who attacked and killed the Army's foragers, known as bummers. In this, Atun-Shei is not telling the whole truth. Though he insists he believes Sherman is a war criminal, he's doing everything he can to diminish the horrors Sherman's army committed during the march to the sea. Secondly, Atun-Shei mentions how the Union initially treated the South cordially and with restraint. However, what he neglects to mention is the North were the ones to break this cordiality early on in the war. The most notable example of this break in cordiality begins in July of 1862 with General John Pope. After assuming command of the newly formed Army of Virginia, an army consisting of 55,000 men, he issued a series of general orders to his army. On July 18th, 1862, he issued General Order No. 5, which stated that the troops of this command will subsist upon the country in which their operations are carried on. He stated that the locals would be given vouchers for any supplies requisitioned, but that said vouchers could not be redeemed until after the war and only if they had provided sufficient testimony to their loyalty. Also in July, he would issue General Order No. 7, which stated that the people of the Valley of the Shenandoah and throughout the region of operations of this army living along the lines of railroad and telegraph and along the routes of travel and rear of the United States forces are notified that they will be held responsible for any injury known to the track, line, or road, or from any attacks upon trains or straggling soldiers by bands of guerrillas in their neighborhood. It also states that anyone living within a 5-mile radius from such a destroyed area would be held liable. Yet, it only gets worse from there. It also states that if a soldier or legitimate follower of the army be fired upon from any house, the house shall be razed to the ground, and the inhabitants sent prisoners to the headquarters of this army. If such an outrage occur at any place distant from settlements, the people within 5 miles around shall be held accountable and made to pay an indemnity sufficient for the case. Finally, and arguably most importantly, it states that any persons detected in such outrages, either during the act or at any time afterwards, shall be shot without awaiting civil process. No such acts can influence the result of this war, and they can only lead to heavy afflictions to the population to no purpose. On July 23rd, 1862, Pope issued General Order No. 11, which stated that Commanders of the Army Corps, divisions, brigades, and detached commands will proceed immediately to arrest all disloyal male citizens within their lines or within their reach in rear of their respective stations. This same order also states that such individuals would be required to take an oath of allegiance and, if they refused, would be treated as a spy. If they are suspected of breaking such oath, then they are to be executed. It was these following orders that deeply angered the Southern population, especially the men of the Army of Northern Virginia, her generals, and the Confederate government in Richmond. In fact, General Order No. 5 was so grossly abused by Union troops that John Pope was forced to release General Order No. 19 on August 14, 1862, which had to explicitly state that Order No. 5 was being grossly abused. It stated, explicitly, "It is to be distinctively understood that neither officer nor soldier has any right whatever, under the provisions of that order, to enter the house, molest the persons, or disturb the property of any citizen whatsoever." This heavily infers that, after the issuing of the order, there was a significant number of cases of the gross abuse of such orders by Union troops, enough that John Pope needed a general order simply to clarify the intent of the order. It was these specific set of field orders that showed, early on, that the Union had dropped any pretenses of treating the South cordially. Rather, they had shifted over towards treating the Southern population in a harsh manner, which would become more widespread as the war progressed. By 1864, the Union had no pretense of treating Southerners cordially, which had less to do with the Southerners themselves and more to do with the progressive frustration of the continuation of the war. It was the actions of Union generals that accelerated the increased brutality of the war as much as any other group. Yet, if you were to take Atun-Shei's video at face value, none of the above context would be addressed. Rather, such context is conveniently left out, almost as if the video is acting as a form of subtle defense of Sherman and the Union's actions during the war. Shortly after his tentative defense of Sherman, he goes on to play his own game of whataboutism by bringing up Joseph Wheeler's cavalry and how they were, allegedly, rowdy and also plundered from civilians as much as Sherman's men did. The issue with this is the original claim about their rowdiness is not entirely true. Even if we assume it is true, he contradicts himself by stating that it was widely condemned. Sherman's actions in Georgia and South Carolina, however, were not condemned by Lincoln's administration, nor by most of the men under his command. In fact, even Atun-Shei has a moment of self-awareness through his straw man, Johnny Reb, who rightfully points out that it's a whataboutism, though, again, he tries to defend this by arguing that there is a distinction that has to be made between unbridled cruelty and regular foraging activities. The issue with this statement is self-apparent. Sherman's march was excessively cruel. He talks more about how the pretenses of conciliatory warfare were dropped by the Union Army and mentioned how the Southern population detested the Union forces. Again, you only need to look at Pope's general orders to see why the Southern population detested the Union Army. This, of course, doesn't get into the entire issue of an occupying army holding a region that did not want them there to begin with. Namely, the gross abuse of power on the Army's part and the general inability to express discontent among the civilian population's part. We see this referred to again in Pope's general orders, which treat the civilian population harshly for being in association with those causing trouble. Such action would inevitably turn any population against those armed forces. He then brings up a point about Sherman's actions in Kentucky in late 1861 as an example of this shift, but subsequently ignores that Sherman already had a pretense of judgment on how his cruelties would be enacted. For instance, when moving into North Carolina from South Carolina, he dramatically curtailed his army's cruelties because North Carolina had barely voted for secession. His treatment was discriminatory, based entirely on support, or lack of support, for secession, a belief that he likely held as early as 1861 with his time in Kentucky, a state that had not seceded from the Union. Such crimes would never be tolerated there, but were acceptable in the quote-unquote rebelling states. This, again, is a major oversight by Atun-Shei, one that he carries over in his spiel about Sherman's change of heart towards a cruel style. Over the course of the next 4 minutes, he discusses a number of factors, which are hard to address individually as there is quite a lot of information to unpack. So, instead of directly answering them, as I have been doing here, I believe a general rundown of what Sherman's men did and what Sherman desired to do is in order. Firstly, we should understand Sherman's psychology. Sherman, by 1864, firmly placed all blame upon the South for the war, yet his disdain for the war that he blamed the South for had become a deep, bitter hatred of the Southern population in general. In fact, in the very telegram sent to Ulysses S. Grant describing how he was going to, quote-unquote, make Georgia howl, he stated, "Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it, but the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources." Repopulate Georgia? The utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people? This, by itself, expresses Sherman's intentions of conducting the march. He wasn't fighting any armies or merely destroying military assets, but was advocating for what is, in effect, a genocide in all but name. His hatred of the Southern people had so heavily blinded him that he was willing to stoop to the annihilation of the Southern people. This is why he is branded as a war criminal by Southerners. His intentions were not merely about waging a war, but seeking virtual annihilation. This is why he was willing to overlook particular crimes throughout the march to the sea, particularly by his bombers. Bombers were, for the lack of a better term, regular Union Army personnel who acted as foragers for the Army. Due to their non-military activities and due to being distant from the main military force, they would often engage in numerous crimes, from theft and vandalism to arson, threatening murder of civilians, and numerous other crimes. In many cases, they left no food for the families they ransacked, leaving them to starve during the winter of 1864 to 1865. It is likely that hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians would have died as a result of the famine induced by the depletion of the food stores, deaths that would not be counted in any official records. Virtually all of these crimes were overlooked by Sherman and his higher-ups, and in fact, retaliation against the acts of the bombers were received by targeting Confederate POWs. In February 1865, a considerable number of bombers were being killed by civilians acting in retaliation to the sacking of Columbia and by their constant harassment of the civilian population. In response, Sherman wrote to Wade Hampton threatening to kill Confederate POWs for every Federal killed by these reprisals. In response, Wade Hampton stated that he would kill 2 Union POWs for each Confederate POW killed, affirming that the bombers were thieves, thus justifying their murders. Allegedly, Sherman did not make this a policy. However, there are accounts of Union troops executing POWs for these reprisals. Throughout the duration of Sherman's march, atrocities were commonplace and done in gross excess. Some of these atrocities, such as the burning of Columbia, were mentioned by Atun-Shei in the video. However, he did neglect to mention one particular atrocity committed by one of Sherman's generals. On December 9th, 1864, General Jefferson C. Davis, in command of the 14th Army Corps of Sherman's army, crossed over Ebenezer Creek. Behind his force was a significant number of recently freed slaves following the army. These freed men, women, and children had been following the army since the march began and had been slowing their progress. In response, General Davis decided to hastily remove the pontoon bridges, leaving their followers on the opposite bank, more likely than not to be captured and returned back to their respective plantations. Rather than returning, many opted to attempt to cross the creek. Most of them could not swim, resulting in a considerable number of black men, women, and children drowning, possibly upwards of hundreds of people. General Davis received no punishment for his actions that day. This specific incident was one of the few incidents that had to be addressed as it caused significant public outcry, forcing Sherman and Secretary of State Edward Stanton to respond in the form of Special Field Order No. 15, which redistributed 400,000 acres of South Carolinian land to the recently freed slaves in 40-acre lots. This would be the only incident where Sherman's actions saw him receive any form of consequence and significant demand. There would be no such reconciliation for any of his other crimes, nor punishments handed out to the actions of his men. To put it simply, Sherman did not care what cruelties he inflicted upon those he fought against. He was willing and able to commit as many cruelties as he wished for little to no consequences for his actions. It is this unbridled cruelty that made Sherman notorious in the South. Even Pope, infamous for his orders, had some sense of restraint and had to reclarify his intentions. Sherman could care less, if not excitedly perpetuating these crimes by allowing his men to get away with them, even retaliating when his men were, rightfully, targeted for their actions against the civilian population. With this being said, I've covered many of the points addressed between the 12-minute and 17-minute mark of the video. It's at about the 17-minute mark that he shifts the conversation again, this time to discuss a few more whataboutisms concerning Southern leaders and their thoughts on how the war should be waged. Firstly, he quotes Jefferson Davis by stating the following.
The torch and sword can do their work with dreadful havoc, and starving millions would weep at the stupidity of those who had precipitated them into so sad a policy.
It's odd that he quotes this particular line, as Jefferson Davis also expressed his general aversion to the war on multiple occasions. In fact, in his resignation speech before Congress on January 21, 1861, he states the following. I find myself, perhaps, a type of the general feeling of my constituents towards yours. I am sure I feel no hostility to you, senators from the North. I am sure there is not one of you, whatever sharp discussion there may have been between us, to whom I cannot now say, in the presence of my God, I wish you well, and such I am sure is the feeling of the people whom I represent towards those whom you represent. I therefore feel that I but express their desire when I say I hope, and they hope, for peaceful relations with you, though we must part. They may be mutually beneficial to us in the future, as they have been in the past, if you so will it. The reverse may bring disaster on every portion of the country, and if you will have it thus, we will invoke the God of our fathers, who delivered them from the power of the lion, to protect us from the ravages of the bear, and thus putting our trust in God and in our own firm hearts and strong arms, we will vindicate the right as best we may. If anything, the quote Atun-Shei is referring to is a lamentation of the consequences of their actions in the Senate and House. Jefferson Davis did not want a war, but found himself in the position of having to lead one. He understood the consequences well, which was the expression of intent with his statement during his farewell address. After this, Atun-Shei goes on to state that the South expressed desires to do much the same as what Sherman did to the North. Yet, he ignores the obvious context that most of his statements he references have. They take place after the North had already been doing the same thing in the South for years. Even the sources he uses directly mention that they had been experiencing these things for years by this point in time. These weren't done because the South wanted to commit violence, but were expressions of intention in response to the North's actions in the South. Even then, most of these acts weren't followed through more than they were expressions of anger and frustration at the dramatic cost of the war up to that point. He brings up Jubal Early's raid of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in July 1864 in order to have a justification of his point. What he ignores is that Chambersburg was done in response to what Major General David Hunter had already done several months prior in the Shenandoah Valley, which included the burning of the Virginia Military Institute and the terrorization of locals in the valley. This was all a part of the Union's ongoing Valley campaign to lay waste to the region and destroy the food-producing region. As a result of these raids in the Valley, Jubal Early decided to ride northward towards Chambersburg, which lay not too far from the Valley, and raided the town. Early's raid was purely a product of Early's actions and came about specifically because the North had already been doing the exact same thing in Virginia. Then Atun-Shei goes on to quote Jackson, stating the following.
We must destroy industrial establishments wherever we find them, break up their lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines, seize and, if necessary, destroy the manufactories and commerce of Philadelphia and of other large cities within our reach. Take and hold the narrow neck of the country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, subsist mainly on the country we traverse, and make an unrelenting war amidst their homes, force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South in the Union at bayonet's point.
Again, what is ignored is context. By the time Jackson made these remarks, he had already fought off multiple Union forces during the Valley Campaign of 1862 and had already seen and heard about John Pope's infamous General Orders, which had advocated for the exact same thing months prior to his suggestion. Even so, Lee never went through with these tactics. In fact, during his second Northern campaign, Lee explicitly told his men to not terrorize the local population, which included the town of Chambersburg, a town that served as a temporary base of operations for the Army of Northern Virginia during the Battle of Gettysburg. In no uncertain terms, when given the option to do as Sherman, Pope, Hunter, and numerous other Union generals would do, Lee opted to not go through with it. In no uncertain terms, the South's actions were not done in a proactive fashion to end the war, but were done in response to the North's actions in the South. Even so, some generals never went through with it and acted with the sense of humility rather than letting their desire for vengeance get the better of them. After his second round of whataboutism, Atun-Shei goes on to, well, I think I'll let you guys watch and judge it for yourselves.
If Stonewall Jackson were in charge, the South would have easily won the so-called Civil War. Would have taken a couple weeks at most. Sherman was only good at burning down old widows' houses. He would send other generals after Forrest to go get beat. He didn't go himself because Nathan would have just bitch slapped him off his horse. That would have been embarrassing for him. Probably would have started crying.
The fuck you just say?
Billy Hank, that's not funny. Put the gun down, please.
No, really, I couldn't hear you. Why don't you say that again?
Please. I don't.
Say it! Fucking say it!
I said Sherman was only good at burning down old ladies' houses.
That's actually a common misconception.
Exorcism. In either case, he goes on to make an argument about how Sherman designed his campaign to avoid any military forces, to which I ask, what military forces? The only major military force opposing Sherman in Georgia was Joseph Wheeler's cavalry, which didn't pose much of a threat. Most of what Sherman faced were militia units, consisting of old men, young boys, and just about anyone who was left in the area. When they confronted them, these incidents often ended in horrifically bloody one-sided affairs that posed little to no threat to the overall army. In truth, Sherman didn't face much of any opposition and could easily avoid it if it seemed even slightly inconvenient. This is why I hesitate to call Sherman's march a military campaign. There wasn't much of a military to fight. Rather, it was closer to a sacking, not much different to Caesar's brutal campaigns in Gaul or Attila's rampaging through Europe. From there, he goes on to discuss the strategic component of this, which he brings up several points, which can be agreed with in part. Yes, taking out food stores and industrial centers is effective at winning a war. However, the issue is Sherman also took out the agricultural basins used to feed not just the armies, but also the local population. Much of what was taken also fed everyone in the region, from the plantation owners and their slaves to the yeoman farmers and their large families. The bummers didn't just take what the army needed, they took everything they could and burned the rest, leaving the people living there with little to nothing to eat after the growing season had ended and winter was beginning to settle in. If no other crime suffices, then it is the starvation of the civilian population by seizing all of their foodstuffs that constitutes Sherman as a war criminal during the March to the Sea. After this, he goes into an overview of the burning of Columbia, which isn't really that bad of an overview. In fact, I'm surprised he even discussed any of Sherman's war crimes, especially the catastrophe that was the burning of Columbia. Even so, he then goes on to say the following.
The question of do the ends justify the means can never really be answered. I'll save that for the YouTubers who talk about philosophy. But from a purely historical perspective, Sherman was right. He broke the back of the Confederacy, hastened the end of the bloodshed, and undoubtedly saved more lives than he destroyed.
That's pure speculation.
Not really. His methods were effective, and the words and actions of Confederates proves it. In the month after the fall of Columbia, 8% of the Army of Northern Virginia deserted. James Longstreet's corps actually had to set a stronger picket guard in its rear to prevent desertion than in its front to protect against the enemy. And the number one cause of desertion? The news of Sherman's march and the desolation that these soldiers' families and communities had suffered at home. Among the people of the South, the desire for peace had outgrown the desire for independence. As Georgian author Eliza Francis Andrews put it,
I used to feel very brave about Yankees, but since I have passed over Sherman's track and seen what devastation they have made, I am so afraid of them that I believe I should drop down dead if one of the wretches should come into my presence.
Yes, doing those things was effective. The issue is their war crimes for a reason. It's not because they aren't effective, but because they are excessively cruel, bordering on genocidal. The reason we even have concepts such as the rules of war or war crimes is because of men like Sherman, men willing to commit heinous acts in order to win the war. It's that exact mentality that led to Fritz Haber to develop a method of deploying chlorine gas as a weapon of war against the French and Russians. It's the same mentality that drove the carpet bombing of German cities and the firebombing of Japanese cities during the Second World War. In the end, they are effective at their job, but it doesn't make them right. These things are war crimes for a reason, and rightfully so. Atun-Shei's video is an absolute mess. He bounces around far too much for it to be easily understood and discussed from point to point. He constantly pivots from one point to the next rather than explaining the topic point for point. Worst of all, this video left me with a sour taste in my mouth. This is not something Atun-Shei should even be debating, since it is about as objective of an answer as you can get. Was Sherman a war criminal? That is an undeniable yes. To make things worse, Sherman was no bystander, but a willing facilitator in these terrible atrocities committed against the civilian population, one who was willing to go as far as to defend his own men when committing these heinous acts by committing additional war crimes. There is no plausible deniability for him and his actions. Yet, Atun-Shei still tried to find some way, shape, and form to defend his actions with constant whataboutisms, ignoring context, and, worst of all, justifying these acts by stating their effectiveness. This reminds me of a line from The Innocence of Father Brown by G.K. Chesterton, which goes something like this. Men may keep a sort of level of good, but no man has ever been able to keep on one level of evil. That road goes down and down. Always be wary of what evils you may justify. Keep your moral scruples intact, and whatever you do, don't justify war crimes. I hope all of you have learned something from this, and may God bless all of you.